Sex in ancient Egypt had a completely different axis of pleasure and decency than in the modern world, but that doesn't mean that the ancient Egyptians did whatever came to their minds, or that ancient Egypt was one big mass sex party. Sexual acts with animals, corpses, siblings all have their place in the history of sexuality in ancient Egypt. Necrophilia, or love for the dead, arose directly in the process of mummification. Most people know that the ancient Egyptians practiced mummification, but the embalmers who carried out this process did not always treat the bodies of the deceased with care. The ancient writer Herodotus recorded rumors that at least one embalmer had slept with the corpse of a beautiful woman, which raised concerns about sexual acts between embalmers and corpses. If colleagues found out that an embalmer was using a corpse for carnal purposes, they immediately reported it. Instead of waiting for the body of a very beautiful woman to decompose a little, families would wait a few days before the embalming took place to protect the body from the perverse embalmer. According to some claims, Cleopatra made a vibrator out of bees to satisfy her sexual appetite. Legends were created and plays were composed by Shakespeare himself about Cleopatra's sexual desires. When the Romans entered Egyptian territory, Cleopatra had a son out of wedlock with Julius Caesar. Later, she began an intimate relationship with Mark Antony, which ultimately cost him his life. But when her bedroom was empty, Cleopatra usually found other ways to satisfy herself. According to rumors, she would take a pumpkin, fill it with bees, and then use it as a device for pleasure, like a vibrator. It should be noted that the story of the bee vibrator has always been a rumor of unknown origin and not a verified fact. However, there is a version that the kish bees inside this device made it vibrate and move, which was ideal for the supposed purpose of satisfying Cleopatra's desires, or the dominance of animal instincts played a unique role in art. Thus, Egyptian hieroglyphs dating back thousands of years, before our era depict people sleeping with animals. Egyptian gods and goddesses often took the form of animals, so the idea of a human and animal copulation depicted in drawings had a divine connection. Additionally, the ancient Egyptians considered sexual acts depicted between a human and an animal to be less offensive from a visual point of view than the same actions between two humans. So some argue that the depiction of hieroglyphs resembling bestiality is a coded image of a sexual act between a human and an animal. Incest, and among ancient Egyptian gods, goddesses, and royal individuals. Most people in ancient Egypt did not engage in incest, but Egyptian royalty and mythological gods often married and had children with their siblings. And since royal individuals liked to imitate the gods, brothers and sisters ruling Egypt often entered into marriage with each other. Unfortunately, all these marriages led to weak family lines with a large number of genetic defects. For example, scientists believe that King Tutankhamun had a degenerative bone disease, cleft palate, spinal deformities, and other disorders. Virginity was not particularly important in ancient Egypt. Egyptians did not attach much importance to virginity. Marrying a virgin had no significance. Premarital relationships were openly practiced, and if it happened between two unmarried people, there was no shame in it. Virginity also did not have such religious significance as it did for the Romans, who equated virginity with divinity and considered sexual abstinence a great virtue. Virginity was a serious prohibition for a spouse. If you were a woman, premarital sexual acts were normal. The ancient Egyptians considered married women particularly sacred, so extramarital relationships were seen as serious moral and social taboos. It is not surprising that the punishment for infidelity was extremely severe. Punishment for engaging in a consensual relationship with a woman could include beating or even mutilation. In some cases, execution was also possible. However, if a married man slept with an unmarried woman, he would only face some shame from society. In turn, divorce in ancient Egypt was only allowed under two conditions: infertility or wife's infidelity. Masturbation in ancient Egypt was associated with their first god. According to cosmology, the first god, Atum, emerged out of nothingness, essentially creating himself from primordial material. He then set to work on creating the world. But first, he engaged in masturbation. The ancient Egyptians believed that Atum created the goddess Tefnut by spitting her out from his mouth, and they in turn created other gods, goddesses, and various civilizations. The ancient Egyptians wanted to imitate the gods in everything, so they considered male masturbation almost divine. There are even stories about the pharaohs performing ceremonial masturbation in the Nile River. In conclusion, let us remember the words of the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who once said, "Egypt, it is the gift of the Nile." The life-giving waters of the Nile nourished not only the land, but also the stories of the people who lived along its banks, leaving behind a legacy that still amazes our imagination today.